Thank you. And I wanted especially to thank Julian, Marina, and Clerk for such a warm welcome and their hospitality, and of course the Veritas Forum for putting on these types of events, which are just great opportunities for conversation, not only between a couple people, but with the whole community. So thank you so much. My main area of specialization is not in Christian philosophy, but in ancient Greek philosophy before Christianity existed. So it was challenging to think about how to give this talk in relationship to being Christian. But as I reflected further on it, I realized that my own interest in the topics of vulnerability and woundedness really came out of being a Christian and considering those kinds of issues. Or maybe to put it the other way around, learning how to live well as a human being is part of philosophy. Philosophy is not merely the practice of ideas in an abstract sense, but actually how do we live out those ideas in our real lives. Christianity, likewise, is not simply a religion, but it's about how to be human. So I think there's a certain amount of overlap in those kinds of concerns hopefully we can explore today. I define vulnerability as the capacity to be wounded, relying on the root of the English term vulnerability, vulnus, or wound, as its basis. We as human beings are capable of being wounded, physically, psychologically, spiritually. Such wounding is experienced by individuals, but sometimes also by entire political communities, in which the ruptures can be a wounding of identity, the death or exile of some of its members, or political divisions and differences that seem to irreconcilably divide a community. Yet a wound is not only a locus of injury. A wound is also an opening. To be vulnerable is also to be open, either to choose by an act of the will to remain open to others, or sometimes involuntarily to be opened up. Although such an opening may be fearful or painful, this opening is also the very source of the possibility of connection that closure does not allow. Remaining closed does not allow for connection. Self-sufficiency as an ethical ideal, which we see in philosophers such as Aristotle, might make possible my own happiness if that happiness depended upon nothing outside of myself or as little as possible. However, if our nature is not to be self-sufficient but interdependent, then it seems that the very possibility of happiness requires openness to others, an openness that can be creative or an openness that can lead to wounding. Perhaps even more surprisingly, such openness can lead to both, wounding that in itself later becomes creative, where the wound becomes the very ground for the possibility of the emergence of something new. To use Christian language for a moment, the grain of wheat that must fall to the ground and die to create new life, from John 12, communicates this idea of vulnerability. Even more fundamentally and simply, to love is by its very nature to be vulnerable to another. For Christians, love is the very nature of who we are, what we are, as creatures made in God's image, a trinity of love. To be capable of being wounded then means to take up an ethical attitude of openness, to remain in a stance that leaves oneself exposed rather than fully protected from the harm that can come from others or from chance events. It means to risk being harmed and to be willing to risk feeling the effects of having been harmed, and even to know the reality of our also being sometimes agents of harm, what Christians call being sinners. In all of this, I think we have to be careful to be clear that suffering itself is not a good. The ideal situation would, of course, be a vulnerability that never leads to suffering, one in which mutual openness within a community were always met with compassion and a community's self-knowledge of the interdependence of its members, that is, our need for one another. So to be clear, I want to maintain, of course, we ought to strive for justice, virtue, and to avoid the harm of others or self. To argue in favor of vulnerability is not to argue for masochism or martyrdom for its own sake. But as I will try to show, it's not only in a stance of openness, but even in the encounter with the wound itself that friendship and political community are sometimes created. It is not good to suffer harm or to harm others, but in a world in which harm and suffering are real, in which suffering happens, often as a contingent fact, our meeting of the wound, our woundedness and self and others, offers a possibility for a depth of human interconnection that is lacking in an invulnerable stance. So this evening I'm going to briefly introduce where I see this first in the context of ancient thought, looking at Homer's Iliad, and we can talk about other texts maybe a little bit later, contrasting the wounds of immortal gods and ordinary mortal men. And then I'll briefly say something about how I see this theme of vulnerability in the life of Jesus and the discipleship of being Christian. Homer's Iliad details the wounds of a number of men who are injured and die in the battlefield at Troy. Both the wounds of the Greeks and those of the Trojans are handled with sensitivity. Perhaps surprisingly, however, the immortal gods are also subject to injury. But they are not truly vulnerable, as Homer presents human vulnerability. So what I mean by that, although they have physical wounds, their wounds have no lasting effects on their sense of self, their community, or their history. They do not serve as any kind of opening. As a result, the poet suggests, the gods also lack some significant features of human life and community that we human beings do possess. So to give an example, in the Iliad, both Aphrodite and Ares are wounded in battle as the result of actions of human beings, and they're quite vocal in their complaints. Diomedes wounds Aphrodite, but while she experiences pain, the narrative voice of Homer is careful to emphasize that the wounding in no way touches her divine and immortal nature. So here's the voice of Homer. The spear tore the skin driven clean on through the immortal robe that the very Graces had woven for her carefully over the palm's base, and blood immortal flowed from the goddess, Ichor, that which runs in the veins of the blessed divinities, since these eat no food, nor do they drink of the shining wine, and therefore they have no blood, and are called immortal. She gave a great shriek and let fall her son she was carrying. Although Aphrodite bleeds, she bleeds ichor, not blood, and the loss of this blood-like substance in no way affects her immortal state. She does not eat food or drink wine. Food in the Iliad is representative of change and of life and mortality. Later, Apollo will remark to Poseidon, "Shaker of the earth, you would have me be as one without prudence if I'm to fight even you for the sake of insignificant mortals, who are as leaves are, who flourish and now grow warm with life, feed on what the ground gives, but then fade away and are dead. Mortals depend on the growing of crops and must eat new food anew each day if they are to survive." The description of the wounding of Menelaus also provides an occasion to understand more deeply wounding as a source of interconnectedness, in contrast to the wounding of Aphrodite. When Menelaus is injured by Pandarus, the color of his blood is described as the cloud of dark blood. Menelaus' blood drips down his thighs, legs to his ankles, again emphasizing his bodily nature. And this blood is not mere ichor, but genuine blood. For a moment it seems to both Menelaus and to his brother Agamemnon that the risk of death is real. Agamemnon is engaged in the wounds of Menelaus in a way that no god or goddess cares for those of Aphrodite. Homer writes, "Agamemnon, the lord of men, was taken with shuddering fear," the Greek word there is regasin, "as he saw how from the cut the dark blood trickled downward. And then Menelaus, the warlike himself, shuddered in terror." Same Greek word, regasin, is used there. "But when he saw the binding strings and the hooked barbs outside the wound, his spirit was gathered back into him." And Agamemnon immediately worries about the possibility that he is the cause of the wounding. He said, "Dear brother, it was your death I sealed in the oaths of friendship, setting you alone before the Achaeans to fight with the Trojans." And he promises that if Menelaus dies, he will fight for success in the war, lest his brother's death be meaningless. He is utterly concerned for his brother's well-being and the good of the larger community of Greeks. And remarkably, Menelaus' first concern is not for his own wound, but for his brother. He tells him that his war bell turned aside the arrow from the spot that could have done him harm, and he will not die. And Agamemnon then sends for the doctor to come and act as healer. For each brother, the wound becomes an occasion for the expression of mutual love and concern, and leads each to forget his own egoistic concerns in favor of the good of the other. This experience of woundedness and suffering deepens the interconnectedness of both familial relationships and those in the wider political community. Human wounding, unlike the divine, in its noblest moments, is the occasion to turn outward rather than inward. Vulnerability and not virtue or strength alone can potentially become the occasion for becoming other-centered rather than self-centered. Homer does not stop with physical wounds. He shows the parallel phenomenon in the anticipation and anxiety of death. When Andromache and Hector, a married couple, converse before Hector goes off to battle, each confronts the possibility of his death. In the interaction, we can see a kind of anticipatory grief which draws Hector and Andromache together in their last moments. Andromache desires to protect Hector, both for his own sake and for her own. Indeed, his good as her husband and her own good cannot be distinguished. Andromache reminds Hector her entire family was killed by Achilles. She says, "For me, it would be better to sink into the earth when I have lost you. For there is no other consolation for me after you have gone to your destiny. Hector, thus you are father to me, and my honored mother, you are my brother, and it is you who are my young husband." Hector's response is not to assure his young wife that he will survive or all will be well, or to display his strength, but to delve more deeply into the reality of their vulnerable state. His concern is for Andromache more than for himself, and he, like her, notes the manner in which their well-being is intertwined. He says that he cannot act in a cowardly way when others fight, but what troubles him even more than the pain the Trojans will experience is the thought of you, quote, "when some bronze-armored Achaean leads you off, taking away your day of liberty in tears, and in Argos you must work at the loom of another, and carry water from the springs, Messes or Hyperia." Then Hector kisses his son and offers him a blessing, and the poet reports that all who saw Hector leave mourned him while he was still living. They did not believe he would return home again. Here, the vulnerability of the body is connected to the psychological vulnerability of love, especially family love. When Hector lifts up his son to bless him and kiss him, we cannot forget that the body that dies is the same one that gives and sustains life. Life and death are interconnected. Hector's kiss is as much a blessing as his words. And this affectionate kiss from father to son is not just the meeting of two persons' bodies, but also the meeting of life and death. The poetry emphasizes the physical dimensions of Hector's body and reminds us who witness it of the body as the locus for new life and of the inevitability of death. Hector shows a willingness to encounter the emotional fragility that faced both his wife and his son. When he removes the helmet from his head because it's scaring his little boy, he is literally taking his armor off. Here we see that Hector and Andromache share in their experience of anticipatory grief, a movement away from self and toward other that this shared vulnerability makes possible. The early Christian tradition developed in light of both the Hebrew concept of God and Greek influences that were somewhat in tension with one another. On the one hand, the God of the Hebrew Bible is active and involved, a God who cares about his chosen people, who creates, interacts with, and above all, loves humanity. God not only acts in the world, but is responsive to the world. He is active in human history. God walks in the garden with Adam and Eve. God comes to Job in the midst of his suffering and rebukes the so-called comforters for not speaking well of God and their emphasis on God's justice and isolation from God's mercy and loving presence. On the other hand, a certain Platonic notion of God as perfect, unchanging, and self-sufficient also developed. The argument was that if God is perfect, God could never change from a worse state to a better or a better to worse. Therefore, God must always be God's unchanging and perfect self. But this would seem to mean that God is not only self-sufficient, but also incapable of being affected by anything, including us, God's own creation. In the New Testament, however, we encounter Jesus who does suffer. Central to the gospel stories is a ministry of care for others that culminates in the Passion, his suffering and death on a cross, and then the resurrection, which brings new life. Jesus is human like us, fleshy like us. His first cradle is a manger, from the French manger, in Luke's Eucharistic imagery in the Proto-Gospels. Jesus not only performs miracles, but he eats with those for whom he performs the multiplication of bread and loaves. He drinks good wine at weddings and teases his mother before providing it. He spends the last night before his death with his friends, eating the Passover meal. Jesus lives in time and is affected by temporal events. For example, he weeps at the death of his friend Lazarus. He loves deeply, and it is this very loving that brings him to his death. Jesus suffers in being rejected and being humiliated, and he suffers a brutal physical death. And yet this vulnerability does not lead him to turn outward angrily or to retreat inwardly. Rather, we see him continue to act with self-giving love. We hear in Jesus' last 7 words on the cross, across the gospel accounts, this love. Whether he says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," articulating faith through a psalm of lament, Psalm 22, giving his mother Mary to John and John to Mary, or promising 2 thieves they will be the first in heaven. Even on the cross, before the resurrection, God's love in the midst of suffering continues to create. This creativity continues in the resurrection scenes. For example, consider the meeting of Jesus and Thomas, where Thomas's doubt is met by an invitation to touch the wounds of Jesus. Although the passage emphasizes faith without direct sight, I think we can also see in the passage an idea that informs the much later Caravaggio painting, Doubting Thomas, which we have up here. There, Jesus is portrayed as inviting Thomas to touch his wounds, and we see his exposed, healed, but still visceral wound there on the left of the painting. But in the upper right, Caravaggio has painted the garments of Thomas with the fabric torn and hanging, so there is almost the exact same shape on Thomas's shirt as in Jesus' wounds. The pictorial suggestion is that the healed wounds of Jesus are in some ways healing for the wounded Thomas, who, like other disciples, is traumatized by the events of the Passion. We see repeated patterns of healing and being missioned, as with Mary at the tomb, or the disciples being sent out to act in the world after having stayed hidden in the upper room. Luke speaks of discipleship as taking up one's cross to follow Jesus. John makes reference to Peter's own eventual crucifixion, one intimately connected to his love of Jesus and action as a shepherd of God's people. Whereas in Homer we saw Menelaus and Agamemnon share in love in meeting one another's wounds, that kind of love is absent among the Greek Olympian gods. The Gospels go further in uniting the divine and the human in the meeting of suffering with love. How can God be vulnerable? Christian theology has struggled with this question, and we may talk about this more in the discussion period, but sometimes has sought to resolve it by suggesting that Jesus suffered only in his humanity, but that God never suffered in his divinity, that the Godhead remains untouched by the crucifixion. However, we might better revise our notion of what constitutes perfection. What if perfection is not a perfection of self-sufficiency at all, but rather a perfection of love? Within the framework of Trinitarian theology, God is not a static being, but a being whose very nature is love, a constant outflowing of love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, in which the Spirit is also shared with us. If perfection is a perfection in love, then we can make room for the idea that God too can be affected, but in a way that God's loving nature is never diminished. This vulnerability has implications for us as Christians who are asked to love as God loves. Aquinas understood caritas or agapic love as a participation in friendship with God, an infused theological virtue where God's love acts in and through us. Thus, as Christians, we are asked to love our enemies, to act for their well-being despite their attitude toward us. We're asked to allow our own suffering to sanctify us, for example, to deepen our own compassion, or to give energy to work for social justice and to address the suffering of others. The Beatitudes express this paradoxical condition of finding that those who grieve, who are peacemakers, who are rejected, those who are poor in spirit or simply poor, are happy. They are given the kingdom of heaven. On this model, our story and Jesus' story become ever more intertwined, such that our own suffering can be understood as a potential place in which God's creative power can take place. In all this, I think it's helpful to keep separate conceptually vulnerability from other related notions. Vulnerability is not necessarily tragic. Indeed, in the Christian narrative, in contrast to Greek tragedy, love wins. But we could also make the opposite mistake, which would be to ignore suffering as suffering simply because the outcome would be good. This is the mistake that Job's comforters make. They are right to say that God will bind up Job's wounds. They are sometimes pretty good theologians, but they're not really good friends because they fail to see and to be affected by his suffering. Acknowledging the reality of suffering is part of acknowledging our own vulnerability and that of others. In Christian language, the cross and the resurrection are both part of the lived human experience, a human and divine story that begins and ends in love. Thanks.
So my part of the presentation is mostly not going to directly respond to what Marina said, although there will be a couple points at which I'll engage with what she said. I mostly set out to just write down some thoughts of my own as a starting point for the conversation. So as often happens when you ask a philosopher to write about a topic, I started with a whole bunch of distinctions. So I'm going to start with those. I'm going to talk about kinds of vulnerability and some correlative needs that we have as human beings. Then I'm going to more briefly talk about some other things. So I'm going to consider the question, since the topic is vulnerability and virtue. I'm going to briefly consider whether there's some specific virtue that would seem to be specially related to vulnerability. And I'm going to say no. But that's up for debate. Then I'm going to briefly talk about some ways in which you might think that vulnerability can lead us not to virtue but to vice. And then towards the end, I'll just say a tiny bit about something that Marina alluded to. Her example was Aristotle. I'm going to use Socrates as my example in Plato's Apology, namely certain kinds of Greek ideals of invulnerable virtue. And then I'll stop there and we can have our conversation. So first, kinds of vulnerability and correlative needs that we have. I think there are lots of kinds of vulnerability, right? So we could start even just with bodily vulnerability is multifarious. So we can be, Marina mentioned injury and death, but we can also become ill. We can undergo hunger and thirst and exposure to the elements. And all of those features of our vulnerability give rise to various needs that we have. Needs for food and drink and protection from the elements, protection from injury and illness, need for access to medical care when we are injured or ill. And there's a kind of, you might think that in general there's a sort of common denominator for that family of needs that we have, namely money. Money gives us access to all of those things that we have needs for, food and drink and shelter and so on, medical care. I think, second, we are also socially vulnerable. And I sort of think of this as being divided into two sorts of things. There's a kind of general social vulnerability that's expressed in the need for respect or community recognition or honor. And then there's a sort of more personal social need for love and friendship. And I think because those are needs that we have, again, we're vulnerable to the loss of those things, right? We're vulnerable to the loss of respect in the community, to social disgrace, to somebody's deciding that they no longer want to be our friend or loved one, to schisms in family relationships. Just one could go on. Third, it seems to me also that we are in a way intellectually vulnerable. We're fallible creatures. We can get things wrong. We're subject to various kinds of cognitive biases. You can go on Wikipedia and find a list of I don't know, 50 or so of them if you care to take a look. So just to take one, confirmation bias. Like we like to believe that what we already believe is right, and we attend to the evidence and understand and interpret the evidence in ways to confirm our pre-established beliefs. And I think that could be understood as a kind of a sort of intellectual vulnerability that we face. And then I also want to say, I think it's super important that these kinds of vulnerability are interact with one another. There are strong interactions between the different forms of them. So just to take two sorts of examples. One very common example. We often want social recognition or some kind of intellectual achievement, not for its own sake, but for the sake of satisfying various material wants and needs. So sometimes, and this is important for understanding, for example, what's going on when somebody feels vulnerable in the face of some kind of social rejection. Right? One aspect of it could just be intrinsic, like you don't want to be despised by your fellow citizens, your fellow students, whatever the group is. But another aspect of it could also be, could have more to do with the ways in which that renders you vulnerable in other ways, in more bodily, visceral ways. Another sort of hybrid version of this is that often people want money or intellectual achievement for the sake of achieving some kind of status or honor in the community. And this is the characteristic motivation of academics, by the way. The desire not so much for intellectual achievement in its own right, but intellectual achievement for the sake of being respected. So now I've given all of you undergraduates in the audience, you now know the key to the motivations of your professors. I'm not saying that you shouldn't. I'm not saying that you should exploit those, but I'm not saying that you shouldn't. All right. And then lastly, I want to point out that that all of these different forms of motivation are also they're not strictly they're not strictly egoistic, right? So we don't just, and this is related to the social aspect of vulnerability as well. We don't necessarily just care about our own vulnerability, but we also care about the vulnerabilities of our loved ones, their social disgrace, their illness and injury. Just multiply all the things I said apply also to our care for one another. Right. So that's my attempt at a kind of broad taxonomy of kinds of vulnerability that we face and interactions among them. I'm sure it's incomplete. Maybe you all will have ideas about some others. But now I want to turn to the question of vulnerability and virtue, and specifically to ask whether there is a form of, there's a virtue that is somehow specifically directed at dealing with the various ways in which we're vulnerable. It seems like the easiest candidate would be something like courage. Right, so you start with just the notion of, this is clearly relevant to dealing with the prospect or the reality of injury or death, right? You'd think that courage is the virtue that's salient in that kind of situation. But we could also extend that, our conception of courage to include also certain kinds of social courage, like the courage to stand up to those with power over us when they do or say something wrong. And we could extend it also to even to intellectual courage. Willingness to reconsider our views in the light of new evidence, something like that. But I guess I think that, in fact, there's nothing special about courage such that it is the virtue that is most centrally concerned with vulnerability. I think that sort of thinking about vulnerability should inform our thinking across all of the virtues. So just to take two sorts of examples. I think when it comes to, let's say, generosity, my willingness to give money requires some kind of reflection on the role of money in my life and the ways in which money is a source for me of sufficiency, of self-sufficiency, of being less vulnerable. So generosity involves at least some degree of opening ourselves up to woundedness in Marina's terms. But then also other maybe less familiar virtues. I'm just going to use one of Aristotle's examples. He says that wittiness is a virtue. And in attempting to be witty, we make ourselves socially vulnerable, right? We say, here, I think this is the funny. And if others disagree, then we make them maybe to a small extent think less of us. Okay. The other main important thing I wanted to say before turning to the ideals of invulnerability is to sketch out some ways in which you might be worried about vulnerability as leading us not to virtue, and not just, so there's the fact of our vulnerability, the fact that we can be harmed in these various ways, and then there's also our own recognition of our vulnerability. I think both of those, in certain ways, can lead our vulnerability and our recognition of our vulnerability doesn't lead inexorably to virtue, but it can also, in various ways, lead us to vice. And I want to suggest this in a few ways. So first, I just want to point out that there's a sort of connection between the ways in which we're vulnerable and the needs that we have based on our vulnerability. And it's not a universal connection, but there's some kind of pretty strong connection between the ways in which we're vulnerable and the needs that we have, and certain goods that are competitive goods. And by competitive goods, I mean goods where if you have more, I have less. Right? So in meeting our need for food, if there's only one cookie between us and I take it, you can't eat it too. Right? It's a pretty simple-minded point. But similarly with social virtue, honor in the community might be something of a competitive good as well. If Jordan came up to you after the Q&A and said, I just want to give you this trophy in recognition of the wonderful question that you asked, you might feel pretty good about yourself until you saw him going up to every other person in the room who asked a question and saying, I just want to give you this trophy in recognition of the wonderful. Right, so social honor is a thing that if everybody gets the same award, then it becomes less meaningful for me to get the award. So it's a kind of competitive good. All right, so why do I mention this thing about competitive goods? Well, if you think that our living well is largely constituted by our having such goods, goods like wealth and social status, then to that extent we will end up thinking that the good life for ourselves and for those around us, our loved ones, it's not an egoist, non-egoist point, but we'll think insofar as living well crucially involves those competitive goods, we will have to be willing to put it bluntly, screw other people over to get more for me and mine. And I don't need to think of myself as doing those sorts of things either, right? There are certain ways in which I can rationalize the ways in which I harm those around me and redescribe what I'm doing as not really a harm to them, even though that is in fact what I'm doing. Even worse, to the extent that we see others as threatening our wealth or status or bodily integrity or our very lives, or all of those things for our loved ones, to that extent, we will see those people as threatening, and often, if we have power over them, we'll harm them before they harm us. And I just want to point out that my colleague in sociology, Lo Presser, has a book about this, where she argues that in genocide, for example, it's an incredibly common feature of genocide that the people doing the killing have narratives according to which they redescribe the people that they're killing as dangerous to them. And there are sort of smaller, more mundane examples of this as well. So these are just, again, examples, ways in which vulnerability, the fact of our vulnerability and our recognition of our vulnerability can lead us to do the very worst of things, right? Genocide. What's the... Okay. So I want to say two more things then, quickly. One is about, so in light of that, in light of the fact that that vulnerability can lead us to do awful things to one another, you might look around for an ethical ideal that isn't susceptible to that sort of thing, right? Or you might hope to find some way of avoiding these problems, and you might notice that the Greeks, as Marina mentioned, have a variety of sort of less vulnerable or invulnerable ethical ideals. One example of this is Socrates in Plato's Apology. In the Apology, Socrates, so the Apology is the story, it just is Socrates' defense speech, right? And what he's defending himself against is two charges of impiety and corrupting the youth brought against him by Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Now, Socrates does not, in some sense, doesn't defend himself. He does defend himself legally, but his primary concern is to defend his way of life, his philosophical way of life, and to explain to the jury that he is an especially good person, that he is wise, that he's courageous, and in the course of defending philosophy and the philosophical virtues that he sees as central to living well, he says some interesting things. So I'm just going to pick out one. One of the things that he says is, look, these guys, Meletus and Anytus, I recognize they have, in a certain sense, they have power over me, right? They are going to convince you that I'm guilty of these charges, and then they will get you to level whatever penalty they like. So they can kill me. But look, they can't harm me. It's not permitted for a worse man to harm a better. And so there's a kind of appeal to that ideal, Socrates as an ideal figure, where Socrates' virtue, by his own reckoning, renders him invulnerable to certain kinds of harms that you might think are sort of the worst harms that one can suffer. an unjust death at the hands of others. And this is something I just want to mention in passing. In Plato's dialogue, the Gorgias, this is something that Callicles makes a big deal out of. It's also something that Thrasymachus in the Republic makes a big deal out of. So these are two figures who are often described as egoists. But in the same way that, as I was saying earlier, vulnerability can lead to vice not just sort of on our own behalf, but also on behalf of our loved ones. I think it's crucial to understanding Callicles and Thrasymachus, to seeing that their central concern is that Socrates and following the Socratic ideal actually renders us incapable of defending ourselves or our loved ones against those who might do us harm. So Callicles just says over and over again, you won't be able to defend yourself or another whom you care to defend. If you're serious about justice, like in the way that you say that you are, you won't do injustice on behalf of your loved ones. You won't, for example, go in front of a jury and lie or appeal to pity, like explain to the jury that you have young children who are going to suffer if the jury kills you. Socrates says, I'm not going to make that kind of appeal. It's the wrong kind of appeal to make. You have taken an oath as jurymen to make your decision based on the facts. I'm not going to try to persuade you to make the decision based on emotion. Right, so if you're not willing to go in front of the jury and do the unjust thing, make the appeal to pity, then you're going to end up dead, or those who you love will end up dead. And Socrates says, that's right, but that doesn't harm me. It doesn't touch my virtue, which is what really makes me live well. So I just want to conclude with maybe a brief thought about a possible problem with those kinds of invulnerable ideals. And the problem is, the potential problem is that they may be a kind of mere wish fulfillment fantasy or post hoc rationalization, right? So if we really are vulnerable to one another in ways that that make it so that it doesn't matter how virtuous you are, it doesn't matter how just and wise and courageous you are, your life can still be ruined by what other people do to you. Out of a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Out of a kind of disgust with the world as it is, I might sort of conjure up an ideal world, which is not the real world, but this ideal world in which if I just conform to the virtues, I live a blessed life. It doesn't matter what other people do to me. And that's to live a life in that way would be a kind of denial that doesn't seem like a good human ideal. So I don't raise that issue to endorse that response to a sort of Socratic invulnerable ethical ideal, but just to put it on the table as a serious worry, I think, about that kind of invulnerable ideal. I'm going to let it go there so that we can get to discussion.
Yes, so Marina would like to start here by asking Clark some questions about the presentation, so we will kick off and see where it goes.
So I actually wanted to ask you about Socrates a little bit more, because I thought you raised a lot of good points about, on the one hand, his seeming invulnerability of his virtue, which I would want to concede is actually an important part of Socrates. And obviously, I don't want to say that we're always vulnerable in all respects in all Greek philosophy or something like that, right? So to try to, but to kind of get further into that conversation, I wondered whether the three categories of physical, social, and intellectual vulnerability did apply to Socrates, and that maybe the least important vulnerability for Socrates is death. So ironically, right, that we might think that's the biggest vulnerability we have of all, right, so that it ends in death, but that for Socrates, it would be the other things that would matter more. So being intellectually vulnerable, he says in the Gorgias, there's nothing better than to have all my ideas overturned. Most people hate that. All of his interlocutors seem to dislike that quite a bit, but he does seem to think that's a good ideal. Or social invulnerability. That there's a way in which shame, for example, plays a positive role in the dialogues. So to be socially vulnerable has a kind of positive effect.
Yeah, I think I'm more convinced by the first part of what you say. It's not that I think that shame plays no positive role in dialogues, but I think that shame itself has a sort of, in the same way that I think vulnerability has a sort of two-faced aspect to it. I think shame has the same kind of problem to it, right? So I'll start there. So I think that shame is not just what Socrates can use to get people to see that there's, for example, that they're trying to maintain positions that they don't really believe, or something in that vicinity. But it's also a way of, I think it's an important way in which people are educated into sort of prevailing ethical norms of their community, which Socrates thinks are fundamentally misguided. So in Republic 6, he describes how people will go to plays or lectures or whatever, and they'll hear what people applaud generously and then what they boo and hiss at, and people will internalize those norms. So they'll sort of, through those processes, they learn what people will admire and despise, and what they feel shame at is shaped, and so that there's a way in which shame sort of plays into the corruption of of the people, or the passing on of a kind of fundamentally mistaken ethical ideal by Socratic lights. But I thought your point about intellectual vulnerability is very interesting. I think it's hard to know what to make of, right? So Socrates thinks that he's the wisest, but he also thinks that what his wisdom consists in is in not thinking that he knows things he doesn't know. So there's a way in which he repeatedly goes around and he opens up his own, intellectual wounds, so to speak, the gaps in his own knowledge. But then he does the same thing to other people too, right? He grabs hold of them and opens up their intellectual wounds or lacks of knowledge.
Yeah, no, the shame thing, I was thinking more about someone like Hippocrates at the beginning of the Protagoras, who blushes because he realizes he doesn't know why he wants to go to a sophist, what kind of teaching he wants to get. So there could be a positive role for shame in precisely in recognizing, knowing what you don't know. Yeah. And then in the Christian context, it would be recognizing you've done something wrong, that there's a kind of healthy shame that could become unhealthy, but that, as a certain part of movement or something, the spiritual life would be a good movement for a time.
Yeah.
If it doesn't remain there forever. So.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking that it's highly contingent on the person or people before whom you experience shame.
Yeah.
Right? So it has to be the right person.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. Good.
Okay, so maybe we can talk about the responses to fear here a little bit. Perceived threats, because as Clerk mentioned, responses to fear leading to violence when then those fears are genuine. So Marina, if you could just talk about the other picture for how to respond to fear.
Yeah, so I tried to think about, so I just finished teaching Luke's Gospels. I'm particularly thinking about that Gospel. And the different ways in which Jesus responds to vulnerability. And I thought maybe he exhibits a kind of phronesis, actually. So it doesn't appear as a term, as far as I know, in the gospel. But, so when he's rejected, early on in his ministry, he's rejected in his own hometown. So he's in Nazareth, he's preaching, and he opens up the passage about Isaiah, about how in his presence, the passage about setting captives free, coming to feed the hungry, is going to be fulfilled with him. And his whole community hates him and starts attacking him essentially. And so he has to, and in that case, he actually doesn't confront it. He's not violent, he's not confrontational, he doesn't fight back. They are in fact dangerous, and somehow God protects him and he leaves. But as his ministry goes on, that seems not to be the only guiding principle. So he tells his disciples, if someone rejects you, shake the sand off your sandals, and that's sufficient. But what seems to happen is, as he's trying to minister to people, and he comes up against religious authorities, there's a point at which he can't continue to love and to minister well and escape or just be non-confrontational. Then, in other words, there has to be kind of confrontation with injustice, or kind of standing for and with marginalized people that doesn't allow him to remain safe. So I think the guiding principle would be, are you acting out of love, out of agapic love, for those with whom you care? Is there a care for justice that maybe would be shared with Socrates and some other Greek figures? But also a kind of discernment or careful phronesis about when and where to do it, how to do it.
Yeah, actually, towards the very beginning of what you said, I thought there was something. The rest of it was interesting too, but there's something I wanted to focus in on
Sure.
at the beginning of what you said, namely the reaction that people had to his saying that he was going to be the fulfillment of the prophecy that he described. Right, so they get violent with him because they, I think, they see some sort of threat, like a sort of overturning of their way of life.
Right.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think because he's claimed to be God, and so it's a threatening of the idea that, only God is God, and here's this guy that they've known probably since he was, a little kid, and he says I'm the fulfillment of it. So there does seem to be a kind of legitimate Jewish concern with the problem of idolatry, but a really fast movement to violence as opposed to further exploration of the question, which is not absent in contemporary religious discourse either, right? A tendency to sometimes be very reactive to difference or to having our religious beliefs questioned instead of engaging in dialogue.
Or even to extremely minor perceived slights to our own religious beliefs.
Right, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so one thing that's striking, like both responses involve, thinking of some things that most people think are very important as just less important, transforming. So in some cases, maybe thinking they're not important, as just diminishing them. So one question there then is what that difference does it make if you think that some of those things will be taken care of, will be healed later, versus I died but my virtue's intact, so those things don't matter?
So I think, there's a way in which obviously this question is relevant for, since I went with Plato, I'll just stick with Plato. There's a way in which this question is relevant for Plato. I think in the Platonic view, it's important, but not that important. So think of, for example, of the Republic, where Socrates argues that justice is, the just person lives a better life than the unjust person, independent of what people think of you, independent of the reputation and rewards that might follow from justice. He gives that whole argument for the supreme importance of justice in Republic 2 through 9 without making any reference to what's going to happen after we die. And that the argument continues into Book 10. Then it's only when he comes to the conclusion of that argument that he then says, oh, and by the way, this fact about justice, that it benefits us so much, is also super important because we keep going after death. But it's not a crucial element of his argument that justice is better for us than injustice. It's just a kind of add-on. Like, however important you thought it was for 70 years, think how important it is for infinity years. Right.
Yeah, Julianus calls that a messy ending to the Platonic dialogue. I actually think there's good stuff going on in the myth, but that particular way of looking at it, I think I agree with the myth. I would say with the question of whether, say, being in heaven, having all suffering redeemed, I don't think it lessens our suffering now. I think it's actually important to understanding Jesus on the cross, for example. He says a psalm of lament, right? He quotes from Psalm 22 and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if we take that seriously as a real statement of Jesus' expression of his feeling, it's a psalm of lament that moves into hope. So if you look at the whole of Psalm 22, it's not a psalm of despair. It's basically lamenting with the idea that the lament moves from suffering into a kind of hope that it will be redeemed. But if we really take seriously the idea that Jesus was not simply God on the guise of a body, but was actually a human being, he can't know with certainty, so I mean knowledge in like kind of strict epistemic sense, that he's going to be raised in 3 days. So even though there are some lines where he says, I'm going to be raised in 3 days, the temple, that was my body that I'm referring to, it must be an act of trust or faith, but not knowledge. Otherwise, his humanity and his suffering make no sense. Otherwise, it's kind of asceticism. He's just the appearance of a human being. So I think that that's important for us to realize that the suffering of our own suffering, even if we have faith and hope and trust that it will be redeemed, and even if we have great certainty that that's the case, I have great certainty that God does do that God creates, and in a way that's what my whole thing was about, is that there's a kind of creativity that comes out of it, but it doesn't lessen the human lived experience that suffering is suffering. And it's actually very dangerous, I think, if we start to think that God just spectates on suffering and doesn't actually experience it in some way.
There is maybe another strand of Plato. So I'm thinking that this only just occurred to me. But at the end of the Apology, right, Socrates does make a point of mentioning that the gods will sort of look after the affairs of a good person, right? Mm-hmm. So, and that's less clearly an add-on. I mean, there are a variety of things that he could mean by that. Maybe the point is not that. I definitely don't think that the point can be. Since God's going to look after me as a good person, all this terrible stuff that's going on is okay. There's still, it doesn't undermine the kind of virtue supremacism that he's been expressing throughout the Apology. But I'm not sure how to make sense of his claim that, or the importance that he places on the fact that the gods will look after a good person. I'm not sure how that fits in with the rest of what he says.
It does seem like for Socrates, it should stand alone to be just, whether or not there is some kind of reward after death, right? Because when the Apology, he talks about, well, we don't know if it's just a long sleep, a really good nap, that even if that's the case, it's sufficient to be just, because for the time that we're alive, that justice grants us some kind of happiness. So, yeah, I would agree with that aspect.
I suppose you could read it as, presumably his family affairs are still his affairs, right? So even if death is annihilation, the first possibility he considers in the Apology. Maybe it's more like, now that he's gone, God will provide for his family.
What do you make of the fact that in the Phaedo, Socrates is the only one that doesn't cry about his own death? All his friends do. So, the Platonic point of view, I always thought, is not the invulnerability of Socrates. Socrates, right, is like, I'm going to drink the hemlock. His only
Make sure you make it double strength.
Yeah, right. That would be effective. And he kind of seems to tell them not to worry. But Plato portrays them, I suppose, because it's historical, right? But as genuinely grieving and weeping and saying, "There's no one else like you, Socrates. There never will be another Socrates."
Yeah, it could be insofar as they have not yet reached Socratic wisdom. Like, it is bad for them. It's not bad for Socrates. He's reached whatever, obviously he has not reached perfect divine virtue or something like that, but he's reached a condition where it's genuinely not going to harm him to die, even an unjust death at the hands of the Athenians. But for his friends who aren't quite there yet, maybe it really is bad for them.
I also wonder, though, even if they both were there, right? Isn't part of the sadness of death just the separation from the person you love, right? So that even if they were all at a perfect state of moral virtue, they still love Socrates. And so maybe they worry, why isn't he more, why is he more sad to leave all of us? but there's a kind of vulnerability just in the connection and the way in which connections can feel severed, or to some extent, or even with a Christian faith, that there is some community between the community of saints and the community here, that there's some, genuine loss in being apart from a parent, a grandparent, a loved one.
So the topic of gods came up a little bit here, God and gods. So if we could go with that a little bit, and maybe start with the kind of conception of God as invulnerable that came up in later Greek philosophy, thinking Plato, Aristotle, so on.
Yeah. So it's interesting. There's a sort of shared ground among ancient Greek philosophers at a certain level of description in their rejection of popular religion, right? So the popular religious tales tell stories of Zeus killing his father Kronos and taking over. We could multiply examples of terrible things that gods do to one another, right? I mean, we could just go with, at the end of Iliad 1, all the gods laugh at Hephaestus because he has a physical disability. Like, the gods do some pretty terrible things. So across the board, Plato, Aristotle, the Epicureans, the Stoics, all reject a conception, that sort of popular religious conception of the gods. They think that the gods have to be good in some way, that they have to be, that they at least will not be unjust, and so on. But then the positive conceptions are interestingly different, right? So you have, there are conceptions on which God plays more of an agential role in the world. So roughly speaking, especially Stoic views, but also maybe Platonic views. So God providentially arranging the world, whereas then there are, and intentionally doing so in the manner of an agent, like planning out what to do and then doing that for the best. Whereas then Aristotle and the Epicureans, interestingly different though they are in other ways, have a shared sort of conception of God as holding apart, right? So Aristotle's God is sort of pure intellect that is living a perfect intellectual life, and if you're living the perfect intellectual life, you have to be thinking about the best things to think about, and the best thing to think about is God. So Aristotle's God, he says, in a very confusing passage, is thought thinking itself. It would be, for Aristotle, it would be sort of beneath God to be looking and planning at things that are not the highest objects in the universe. That would make God's life less than perfectly blessed. And in a similar, although very different kind of way for the Epicureans too, the core conception of God is of an immortal and blessed being. But what follows from that for them is that there's nothing that we can do at all that will matter to them in the least. Whatever injustices we do to one another, they're not going to get angry. It doesn't affect them. Whatever wonderful things we may do, they're not going to be grateful to us. We didn't benefit them. And so they just hang out in the interstices between the worlds, as it happens, enjoying life, but not intervening ever. Is that the sort of thing that you were looking for?
Yeah, thanks. Part of that background is the part of invulnerability, and then also, Marina, you have alluded several times already to, Christian theologies trying to make sense of God's suffering, and probably partly because Christians have often looked to Aristotle for a good part. So if you could just talk about some of that theological tension or directions.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in 20th century Christian theologies that do look to the vulnerability of God. And it's a difficult thing because of this Greek tradition of looking at God as invulnerable for the reasons that you outlined so really nicely there. So for example, post-Holocaust moral theology looked at the Holocaust and said, we can't have an invulnerable God if what we mean by invulnerable is apathetic in the literal sense of doesn't undergo pathos, doesn't undergo some kind of emotional response to what's happening in injustice. So Moltmann has this idea, Jürgen Moltmann, who's one of the post-Holocaust post-Holocaust theologians, says that it must be that God undergoes pathos when Jesus suffers, that the crucified Christ is himself, a suffering God. It's not just Jesus and his humanity, but that God suffers on the cross, because it would be unconscionable for God to have looked at that degree of suffering and not to have cared, that we can't make sense of anything else that we know about God as loving, as concerned with justice, as concerned with mercy, if God doesn't see that, doesn't do more than just see it and spectate but participate in it. So he has this idea that the way the Father suffers when his Son suffers is the way a father would. That if a father saw his son being tortured to death, how could one not, in relationship with love, be affected? So he ends up basically locating the suffering in the Godhead, that it's not just happening to us and God sees it and feels bad, but that actually God is himself experiencing suffering when the Son is suffering. And so that when we suffer, for example, when a community undergoes genocide or something like that, that the suffering of people becomes part of God's suffering, that God is literally in it with us. And along not exact the same lines, but like Black liberation theology and other forms of liberation theology, but I was just teaching some James Cone recently, says we can't make sense of suffering in the world, like the suffering of racism under problems of civil rights in the 70s when he first started writing a lot of this material, unless we can say the crucified God is with us. Like, how can we explain the hope that people have? How can we explain the struggle that people have to fight against these things unless it's the crucified Christ who's among us, not just the resurrected Christ? Because if we say that the resurrected Christ is here and everything's just going to be okay, that kind of thing you pointed to in your earlier question, right? That as long as everything's going to be okay someday in heaven for people, then we ignore real injustices now and we don't fight to change them. If we say that it's going to be all right for those people, because there's always other people, right? It's never my own suffering. It's always someone else's suffering that we say it'll be all right for them later. So he wants to locate the suffering God in and with us. But the hopeful part is that the crucified Christ is the resurrected Christ for Cone. It's not a different Christ. It's the very same one. And that's why that hope can be present. So just a couple of quick examples, but...
Okay. Well, maybe we can shift a bit for the last part of the conversation to maybe specifics of how virtue is affected by vulnerability, different ideas. So Clerk pointed out in conversation to me earlier that both Christians and the Greeks thought of virtue as becoming like God. And then we have these two different conceptions of what God is. So if you could talk about maybe how that translates into what virtue is for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There clearly is a strong connection between the Greek notions of God as invulnerable and the ethical ideal of becoming like God as being a kind of invulnerable ideal. I'm actually sort of interested to know, in light of what you just said, Marina, about the suffering Christ. And there, as I understand it, at least, there is a sort of Christian ideal of becoming like Christ. Do you think that I guess so? From the Greek, on the Greek side, all I can really think to say is yes, there is clearly a relationship there, right? There's a relationship between the ethical ideal of becoming like God, where the ideal is an invulnerable one, and the conception of God as invulnerable. But on the other side, I wonder about surely what you've just said about for example, liberation theology would shape a sort of ethical ideal or an ideal of virtue in those sorts of contexts.
Right. So, for example, I think it conforms to virtuous solidarity, right? That when we see other people suffer, we have to share in the suffering in some sense. It may not be identical for us, right? So I might not know what it's like to suffer in a poor area of Central America. I know exactly what their political struggles are, but that there can be a real shared sense of that we're both human, and that there's something about the seeing, literally in some ways, seeing Jesus in the suffering one that should lead to my participation in that in some sense.
There's have you read this book by Lisa Tessman called, what is it called? What is it? Burden Virtues. Yeah, these people took the class that I taught it in. So So Lisa Tessman has a book called Burdened Virtues, and she has a kind of neo-Aristotelian view. She wants to say that there's in general a sort of connection between virtue and happiness. Not just a connection, but virtue in what you might say in quote-unquote ordinary circumstances, although ordinary circumstances turn out not to be ordinary. Virtue conduces to happiness. To be virtuous is to live well. To be virtuous and to exercise the virtues is to live well. But she wants to argue that under conditions of oppression, the connection between virtue and happiness falls apart. So, for example, there's a way in which to experience the right degree of anger in the face of systematic oppression is not going to conduce to happiness. And so to have sort of to hit the Aristotelian mean with respect to anger, let's say, under those circumstances, will be sort of painful, suffering, difficult life.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I was thinking about with that, so I agree with you, right, with Aristotle that would seem to be a problem. It sounds like a great book that I should read. But so what that made me think about was actually the Beatitudes, right, because there's something very paradoxical with those Beatitudes. So even though it's usually translated, blessed are the poor, or poor in spirit, depending on which gospel, blessed are the peacemakers, blessed are those who grieve or mourn, blessed are these different categories of people. The Greek is makaria, so it just means happy. Happy are the grieving, happy are the poor in spirit, happy are the peacemakers, happy are those who are being rejected. So what that made me think is there's got to be, so what is that about? Well, I think there's different interpretations. One is that when we have those conditions of grieving or being poor in spirit or rejected or working for peace, that's when we know our deepest need for God. And so there's a way in which God comes in to respond to or fill that place. That there's a kind of action on God's part. And that when people are really well off, they tend not to look for those things. They tend to, think I'm all right and self-sufficient. And they even mistreat other people. So there's a lack of human connectivity that can come out of too much comfort and too much wealth and plenitude or something like that. So maybe a distinction that could be made, though, is that there's like happiness and there's happiness. Right? That there's, on the one hand, there's the type of happiness that maybe Aristotle talks about, a kind of self-sufficiency and pleasure, and even like the person dying in the act of courage for Aristotle is happy, not that he's going to die, but he's happy that he's done the right thing. And I don't think that's, I think with the Beatitudes, you could be unhappy in that sense. But you could be happy in the sense that I think it's actually a Christian joy. So we briefly talked about at lunch, a kind of joy in that connection to God and others that can't be replaced with the other kind of happiness. So there's different levels maybe of happiness, or what kinds of happiness that we're talking about.
Yeah, and certainly people talk about the ways in which a righteous political struggle, for example, can be
Right.
Rewarding, fulfilling, happy.
Yeah, in fact, right when I was teaching the James Cone, we happened to be finishing Luke's Gospel, and I was just behind. So I was teaching the resurrection stories just because we hadn't gotten them, and it seemed like a really important part to get to before we finished Luke's Gospel, not to end with the crucifixion. And then we started the James Cone, and it connected really well but on the road to Emmaus, because here are people who are basically in a situation where everything looks like failure. Like it looks like everything that they were working for has completely failed. And then they kind of find Christ in the midst of that, right? They find Christ in the opening of Scripture, the breaking of bread, the community. We can maybe add other things like listening. Or so there's a way in which there's a kind of presence of the happy even in those moments of struggle, right? That it would be wrong, when I see really terrible, violent injustice, not to be unhappy, right? That we think there's something wrong with someone who is too happy or too invulnerable in the midst of witnessing really great injustice. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the hardest question. so you stressed that vulnerability is being open to others, and then contrast that with ideals of self-sufficiency. So, like, what's a kind of trait or response that we might often see as a virtue because it's leads to self-sufficiency or whatever, that is not a virtue from the perspective of this openness or some traits?
Sorry, I'm not sure that I understand the question. Is the idea that, so, is it a question about, so Marina has laid out some ways in which vulnerability and openness can make us have a certain kind of proper virtuous response to one another, and then I raised a little bit of trouble for that by describing ways in which vulnerability can make us lash out or do harm to others who are. Is that the part of the?
Yeah, I think that's along the lines.
And then the question is something. I'm sorry.
Yeah, maybe particularly. So we've drawn the contrast in general terms between being open to others and this ideal of self-sufficiency. But how does that come out in a more specific character trait, maybe? Or specific kinds of actions?
Well, I suppose one example. So I mean, we talked earlier about we talked earlier about Socrates' reaction to his situation in the Phaedo, where he seems unperturbed, and in fact, he's sort of, to be honest, he's pretty heartless, right? So the people around him, he basically says, "Oh, quit your whining." His wife starts crying. He says, "Take her home." He's not, even if there are certain ways in which he's admirable, he's a problematic figure. So that could be an example of where a little bit of suffering along with his friends might have, as a way in which, as a specific case of distinguishing a sort of invulnerable response that Socrates has from a more open, vulnerable response that he could have had, where it looks like the latter might have made him a somewhat more appealing human ideal.
Yeah. Go ahead. You want to finish? Or?
No, please.
Yeah, so I was thinking about actually the Sophocles Philoctetes, which I wrote about a little bit in the book. So in that, I don't know if people know the play, but essentially Philoctetes has been abandoned on an island by Odysseus, who thought that his woundedness, because he's been bitten by a snake and he has a wound that won't heal and he's disturbing their sacrifices, he's left behind. And then it turns out there's a prophecy that they have to get him back and get the bow back. But Odysseus isn't sorry, the Greeks aren't sorry. And there's this kind of wonderful movement where he has to kind of decide to return to Troy, not just because the prophecy said so, but because he otherwise won't be healed, that he has to kind of return to community. So one of the features, I think, that's happening in that play is that he has to come to terms with the fact that the community of Greeks that harmed him are not sorry and may harm him again. So when he says he doesn't want to go back to battle in Troy, his main concern is not, look at what those guys did to me in the past. His concern is, but they might do it again in the future, right? So one common response that I think we all have to being vulnerable is that if trust is violated, the worry is it will be again, right? So that's why people can kind of become closed in certain circumstances. Or I think I would actually see that as one of the explanations for the kind of response to genocide that you gave the example of, right? It's a sense not that vulnerability per se is bad, but that there's something about the vulnerability that we have to reject on the basis of past experiences of how it's been dealt with or something like that, you know? But anyway, Philoctetes, though, has to, in a sense, make a choice that he's going to be vulnerable again, with no guarantees that it will be different, because Odysseus is never sorry. The Greeks never come to apologize to him. And there's a kind of maturity in having to return to imperfect political communities. Like we all, participate in various forms of imperfect communities and institutions. So I think that's a case where the openness is not idealistic, not an ideal case at all, but it's just a necessary case to kind of move forward in life. You know, it's necessary to move forward sometimes and to live in imperfect communities. And your churches are that way, universities are that way. We live in imperfect institutions.
Could I follow up? This is just to shift gears a little bit. I meant to ask at some point about the example of Menelaus and Agamemnon.
Yeah.
Because I thought an interesting feature of that that might be worth reflecting on is that Agamemnon's response to Agamemnon feels compassion for Menelaus's wounds. They're mutually concerned about Menelaus. But then Agamemnon's positive commitment to Menelaus is, and I'm going to kill a bunch of those Trojans to make sure that you have not died in vain. That struck me as maybe an example taken from your talk of where there's a kind of vulnerability of that this death will be in vain. Like there's some way in which Menelaus is vulnerable to dying, not just dying, but dying a death that doesn't matter, that has no larger significance. And it's that mutual fear of Menelaus's meaningless death that then drives Agamemnon to go kill a bunch of Trojans. Which seems like maybe not. I mean, I know that you didn't think that Agamemnon is like an ideal of human virtue. I'm not trying to pin that on you.
Right. So I would want
but just as an example of where things can go a bit awry.
No, and I mean, actually, so just to add to your point, and then I'll think if I have any out. But to be intellectually vulnerable for a minute, Achilles is the best example, right? Because he goes crazy when Patroclus is killed. He just absolutely goes nuts. And he starts to slaughter people and kind of violate all kinds of rules. So, somebody's
in the middle
river,
of Menander, yeah.
Yeah, right. When someone says, "But please grant me mercy," and he says, "No, we're friends in death." It's kind of creepy things he says. So, so he's scary. But so I guess, though I would see that as evidence that the Homeric voice isn't necessarily idealizing revenge. I didn't take Menelaus's response to be, Agamemnon's response to be, I'm going to kill a bunch of people to avenge your death, so much as to say, listen, we've had this undertaking of war for what they understand to be meaningful. We might not, so I'm not sure I think we should go to war to fight over a woman who ran away in adultery. But from the Homeric point of view, this was a war that been taken for some meaningful purpose, and that he would at least finish that work, that he wouldn't allow their very purpose to be undermined. So I took it to be a bit nobler, even if one could still disagree with whether that meets any kind of just war theory conditions, which probably would not.
Could I follow up? I mean, I thought, so I read the first part of Marina's book, although I still have yet to finish it. But I thought actually I thought that one of the best parts of the discussion of the Iliad in the book was about the end of the Iliad, book 24. And Achilles' reaction to Priam is a kind of, it's different from the Menelaus-Agamemnon case, right? So Priam is the king on the other side. And so it's a much nicer case for you of a case in which Achilles, by recognizing Priam's vulnerability to not having his son's dead body, that somehow Achilles achieves some recognition of Priam's suffering that shapes his response in a more compassionate way, maybe, than Agamemnon's.
Yeah, I love that passage at the end of the Iliad because what happens for Achilles is, obviously his rage has sort of diminished, right, already, and he's sort of moved into grief, I guess, in a more serious and healthy way, we could say. But when he sees Priam, he basically is reminded of the fact that Achilles' own father is going to grieve Achilles. So he starts to think about the fact that my dad, because he knows that he's fated to die soon, so he knows he's not going to be around, and his own father is going to be grieving him soon. And that's what allows him to have a kind of sympathetic compassion for Priam as he thinks about his dad. And then it actually becomes almost like their father and son in the same room. They share a meal together. And it says that Priam gazes upon Achilles like beauty And Achilles, looks to Priam and sees like this face of suffering that he can't help but respond to. And there's this line where, at least like the Lattimore translation says, and their sounds of mourning filled the house. So it almost emphasizes here they are in a shared oikos, like a shared space, right? Like a household together. So that's not quite, I don't know if it's loving your enemy, but it's awfully close to it for a Greek text, like a real love and compassion for the enemy that actually comes through their suffering. That's the thing. Like, it probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for their kind of shared suffering and recognition that the suffering is universal.
Yeah.
Oh, join me in thanking Clerk and Marina for this portion. Okay, so yes, at this point we'll take a brief break here to stretch, to leave if you need to, and if we can gather back in 3 to 5 minutes, and it's your turn to ask questions after that. And if you can leave surveys and stuff with the ushers on the way out, please. Your turn to ask questions. I'll call on people. You can direct questions to Clerk or to Marina, but they might both answer or shift as it is. And also, I'll repeat your question after you ask it, simply for the sake of the recording and the fact that we are live streamed. So, who's first? Okay, Josh.
Yeah, this is for Dr. McCoy. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the themes of invulnerability in the Bible. There are places in the Bible where it can kind of seem like a kind of invulnerability is a good thing. So Jesus says, don't fear those who can kill the body. Just fear those who can kill the soul, God. Right? Paul says, do I want to live or die? Well, I'm content with either. Right? And he also says, I've learned to be content in all things, whether I'm hungry or not, whether I'm in need or plenty, I'm content. And Jesus says, don't worry about your life. Don't worry about tomorrow. Right? And these can kind of feel like there's some role to invulnerability in the Christian life. What do you say about that?
Okay, so the question is invulnerability in the Bible, both as regards to death and regards to material possessions.
Right, so that raises an excellent point, and I don't want to say that Jesus is always invulnerable all the time, right? So in other words, the argument isn't that there's a constancy of vulnerability in every situation. So the examples you give, I think it kind of goes back to what we said actually about Socrates earlier, that it does seem like death is the least fearful in some ways of some of these things. The one exception would be that I think I mentioned my tongue. Jesus weeps when Lazarus dies. So although he himself doesn't think that death is the worst thing that can happen, in fact, in this case, it's actually going to be a good, right, a kind of creative good. That doesn't mean there's not loss associated with seeing Lazarus dying. So I think there would have to be a kind of two-part thing there, that on the one hand, the human experience of loss and suffering is real. It's a part of who we are. It's part of our humanity. But that then, I guess it's almost like a metacognition or something, like that the way that we think about that experience is not to lead to despair, but that it results in faith, hope, and love, what Paul names as these theological virtues. And I actually was thinking, as we were talking about the theological virtues, when you talked about what virtues play a role in this, that the thing about the theological virtues is they're kind of incomplete for us, at least faith and hope are, right? So with faith and hope, there's a trust in something happening that hasn't happened yet, right? Or a belief in something that's not fully seen or understood. So I want to kind of say there's a both and happening there, that there is a real trust that God will make everything all right. Don't be afraid because God is here. I think that's right. But also And that is the underlying stance, right? Is that the fearfulness isn't the most important. That we shouldn't be afraid because God will take care of us, and that's right and true. But that doesn't mean we don't experience the real vulnerability of loss and sadness and ordinary fears within that human context.
So it's interesting that for some reason when you talked about the metacognitive point, like that there's a kind of inevitable way in which we're vulnerable, but then there's a sort of higher order thought that we can have, or a higher order attitude that we can have about our own suffering. That actually reminded me of nothing so much as Republic 10 and the discussion of grief there. Right, so that there Socrates says that, right, so when a child dies, for example, maybe the worst thing that could happen, I don't know. There's a sort of inevitable amount of grief that you'll experience. Like there's no getting rid of grief. Like it's just a psychological impossibility that you would not at all grieve the loss of a child. Nobody's going to do that. But he does then sort of suggest that there are better and worse ways of dealing with that grief. Now his response is more of an intellectualist one, I would say, than the faith, hope, and love formula, right? His thought is you should, experience some grief and then turn as soon as possible to planning out the rest of your life, figuring out how you're going to deal with the situation. So it's more of an intellectual response, I guess, is how I would characterize the difference. But there is also, maybe there is actually an aspect that's more, hope-like, in that one of the considerations that speaks in favor of not, so to speak, wallowing in grief is, Socrates says, it's not clear to us how things will turn out. So it's not so much that he has in mind like a positive faith in that things will turn out well, so much as that it's you don't know how things are going to turn out, and so to act as though you know that this is the worst thing that could happen and that everything will be terrible from here on is a kind of intellectual hubris, maybe.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Let's see. Go ahead, sir. Yeah.
This is really a question for both of you, but Dr. Shaw, you brought up the thing about genocide. Your colleagues' research shows that the oppressive agent, at some level, fears the oppressed, and at least tells stories that way.
Yeah.
And I've been thinking a lot the last couple of days, along with a lot of the world, about racism on campus.
Yeah.
And how that seems to map on in a similar way, where you've got the oppressing group at some level frequently can be shown to fear the oppressed.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if, out of the study on vulnerability, if there's some wisdom on how we might, as a group trying to improve things in the world, attend to these different fears and senses of vulnerability, whether real or falsely imagined. And if it might improve things so where people are not so much shouting past each other, or emailing past each other, but coming to some kind of better situation.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, so to restate the question briefly, how can we use insight about vulnerability to avoid the kind of responses to threats that come out of fear?
Yeah, so when you were talking just now, the example that came to mind for me was Tamir Rice. He's just a 12-year-old kid playing in the park with a toy gun, and because of structural racism, it's very, some people come up with perceive him as a potential threat because he's African American, and don't stop to think twice about killing him. So he's the one who's genuinely in danger in that situation, but he's conjured as a sort of threat, and that's what ended up doing him in. I wish I had more to say on the other part of your question about I wish I had more by way of insight into how to avoid those sorts of things.
I mean, I think it has a lot to do with vulnerability, actually, and a proper response to it, because so if we look at things like, I think there's a way in which often, I don't want to speak for everybody, but if we really looked at how bad racism was, it should make us deeply vulnerable. And meaning not just people who are experiencing it as victims, but people who are part of the oppressive group, that we should feel sorrow, sadness, remorse, sense of sin, and that in the desire to avoid the difficulty of those feelings, it's easier to kind of push it onto other people. So I think a good example is, I think people had a pretty interesting discourse about the riots of Baltimore last year, that this is the legacy of going all the way back to slavery, but at least more recently to like conditions of poverty, to conditions of racism, to like a lot deeper structural problems that we just kind of were like, oh, I don't want to see that. I don't want to have to engage with what the community is actually going through. Because I think the connection to vulnerability is because it makes me too vulnerable to really see it. Like if I really see it, I should feel pain and sorrow and a sense of sin. And that's why things escalate eventually, because we kind of keep pushing things in until there's sort of nowhere for it to go. But it kind of has this. It finally has to show itself in some way because it's not being seen. So that's why I think the sense of shared vulnerability or solidarity becomes so important. It has to be that your suffering in some way is my suffering. It can't be pity, it can't be, oh, those people suffer. It has to be, we're all suffering in some sense, but some people don't want to see it, I think.
My question is particularly to Dr. Shaw or Dr. McCoy can probably also answer this. Since you take the view that sometimes when we are the most vulnerable, that can open the door to vice.
Yeah.
I would like to try and point this to maybe like the apostolic area and the growing pains of the early Christian church. Let's say, for example, the Apostle Paul. During his life, he suffered greatly. So like he was frequently, thrown in prison, not knowing that if that would be his last night. He was frequently under the threat of death. And sometimes he would even admit to, let's say in his letter to the Philippians, that sometimes he just felt like giving up. So in those situations, he was not only physically vulnerable, but also probably emotionally and intellectually vulnerable. So could you say that that when Paul was personally in those situations, that he could have also been open to vices sometimes?
Yeah, I didn't mean to make any kind of general claim to the effect that when we're vulnerable, there's always a temptation to vice or anything like that. I was really my purpose was just to provide a kind of complementary view that would enable us to look at both sides of the issue together and evaluate for ourselves what the relationship is between vulnerability and virtue. I honestly don't know enough about Paul in particular to say.
I can save your thesis for you, though.
Oh, please.
Which says Paul was a
on.
persecutor first, so he was a Jewish person who, before his conversion experience, persecutes. So it might go. You could maybe make that argument that he feels there's a threat to his religion that's going on, and so he persecutes the Christians actively. And he's even named as standing there when the first Christian martyrs of Stephen is being killed, and it names actually in Acts that he's there, standing there. So then the question is why the change? Well, he had a vision of being knocked off of a horse. So if God tells you to stop persecuting people in that great kind of conversion, that might be an important message. But that he's a good example of someone who does both, right? He both responds to vulnerability as a kind of reactive, violent, and then willing to accept the same violence against himself, with maybe even compassion for the persecutors, right? Because he was himself one. He talks about that a lot. That he himself once was this person.
Yeah, I mean, one interesting thing about that is the way in which, so the early persecutors of Christians, so whether it's Paul in his earlier days or Roman persecution of Christians, can center around a kind of felt threat to just an existing way of life, like
Jordan. One of the things that seemed to come out in the discussion was that there's a relationship, perhaps, between vulnerability and relationships, right? The way we interact with one another. And so I was wondering if there might be, for the invulnerable side of things, if the Greek approach to ethics might lead to an understanding of relationships that some might consider a little strange or perverse. And what popped in my head was, if I recall correctly, the Epicureans sometimes talk about how your friends need to be interchangeable, so you don't feel too much loss when you lose one. You can just like make a new friend, and it's not a big deal. But yeah, I was wondering if one or both of you could maybe speak towards the dark side of vulnerability.
Okay, so can invulnerability lead to a bad understanding of relationships with other people?
yes. Yeah, so your example of the Epicureans, right? So there the idea is that we shouldn't fear, so they have a general kind of thought that we shouldn't be afraid of death, that death can't harm us. Now the claim that death can't harm us comes in a whole bunch of different flavors that are interrelated, but one thing that you might wonder about is, can the death of our loved ones harm us? And the best going response they have to that is, well, A, the person who's died, they think for independent reasons, is not harmed by death because that person no longer exists, so they're not around to be harmed. But then what about we who remain? The idea is we need a big enough community that we can carry on getting the goods of friendship in communion with one another that we had before. So I mean, you put that way, it doesn't sound so awful. But the way you put it was that, how did you put it? That we can just get those goods from somebody else, so it's no big deal.
Our friends are interchangeable.
Our friends are fungible, yeah. Very interesting, we were talking before the session actually about Aristotle on friendship. And it's funny, there's actually a weird sort of way in which, right, so for Aristotle, he thinks the central cases of friendship are going to be cases of virtue friendship, right? So cases in which we engage in excellent rational activity together. There are also going to be centrally cases in which we're equals, right? We're rough equals in virtue and in the other sort of resources and abilities that we bring to the relationship, even if we don't bring exactly all the same things. And he sort of envisions two ways in which we can lose our friends. One is our friends become corrupt and terrible people. And that's a way in which, as Marina has pointed out, that's a way in which we're vulnerable when, because it may not be up to us how our friends decide to build their lives, and our friends are an important good in our lives. So when they become bad people, how do we respond to that? I mean, Aristotle says we should try to bring them back to the virtuous fold. But that doesn't always work. But what I really wanted to point out is that he also envisions another way in which we can lose friends, which is they become too good for us. Not in the sense that they, not in the sense of too good for us that's like, I'm too fancy for you, but in the sense that they genuinely become godlike, and that they sort of transcended the friendship that we had before, and that can be a kind of loss for us sort of normal, schlubby, virtuous people as well.
Yeah, can I just say one quick thing about that too? That I think even in Christianity it can be an issue because, for example, in Ignatian spirituality, which I'm really interested in, there's a concept of indifference, that we shouldn't be too attached to any good. So wealth or poverty, health or sickness, long life or a short one, and the Suscipe. But also sometimes that gets interpreted to mean like not to be too attached to other people. And there's a really interesting tension, actually, I think, between like particular love and universal love in Christianity. On the one hand, we're supposed to love everybody, right? On the other hand, I really should love my children in a particular way and not just, abandon them for like some project of universal love. So I think those things do kind of stand in tension. And in a productive tension. I once heard Timothy Radcliffe give a really interesting reflection on this, where he said he thought within the Catholic Church there's a kind of complementarity to vocations, that when priests and celibates have this kind of universal love, that the project for them is usually, and he was speaking as one himself, is to learn how to love in more particular ways, and not only to love in the universal, more diffuse way. And that for people like myself who would be married, that the project is to learn not only to love my husband, my kids, my best friends, but to love in a more universal way. And I thought that was just an interesting way of looking at the kind of problem that you're helpfully raising.
Let's see. Teresa.
So I'm a medievalist, and so when I think about these philosophical concepts, I oftentimes think about how they get adapted later. And one text that I keep coming back to is Boethius' The Consolation of Philosophy. And that text is interesting because at the start, Boethius has lived this perfect Roman life. He's been a consul, he has wonderful children, politically he seems very invulnerable, then all of a sudden, because of some political coup, he's in prison and he's about to get executed in a pretty horrific fashion. So he has this long conversation with philosophy, for those that haven't read it, where he basically says that because I lived a virtuous life and I attained all these virtues, I shouldn't have been vulnerable. And so philosophy's response then, in some ways, is to say, well, you haven't been harmed. Because the first book is Boethius saying, look, I have suffered all of these different wounds, therefore God cannot be just, and we cannot live in a just universe. Is there any way to let God off the hook without saying that he didn't actually suffer? I don't know, but
Okay, so we have a complex question. I'll try to summarize it briefly.
okay, so first part, if you live a virtual life, you shouldn't be vulnerable.
Okay.
What are your thoughts on that, just looking at it from an earlier Greek perspective?
Yeah, so first thought is, so the mistake that Boethius is making is in in thinking that there's a kind of deal, like a deal with the divine, where I'm virtuous, that's my end of the deal. Your end of the deal is you make sure that I don't lose any material or social good that's important to me. But that's not the deal. The deal is you're virtuous, and what you get in return is virtue. And so, I mean, seriously, the sort of early Greek, to the extent that these folks are sort of invulnerabilists, so to speak, the idea is literally that virtue is its own reward, and that is precisely what makes you invulnerable, is that the other things which can be lost are not the most important goods in your life.
Right, and that's what philosophy kind of tries to convince him of.
Yeah.
But that requires philosophy to convince him he hasn't actually suffered any harm. And that's where I always get stuck as a modern person reading Boethius.
Yeah.
Is there any way to
To-
say
yeah.
that God is just and also admit, yes, you suffer grievous harm, regardless of what happens to you?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have a lot of sympathy for the position that's laid out in Boethius, so it's hard for me to kind of address that. But the problem of evil, obviously comes up in Christianity. The same kinds of sets of questions, right? How can we say that God is just if we actually see that people do suffer harm? And that's why we have books like Job and various theodicies. I think actually my favorite answer to that question is a colleague of mine, Michael Himes, says how to put those things together is fundamentally a mystery, which I know for philosophers is just a terrible answer because it doesn't explain it. But the thing is, we just really want to hold on to the idea both that God is just and good and that the suffering is real. And so I think that's why I like narrative books like Job that sort of do that, that say God is present to us in our suffering, or there's some kind of redemptive process, but we can't fully comprehend the nature of that, and because it seems true that we don't. It seems like the most truthful answer, that we can't understand how those things could all be put together in a coherent way. but that what's most important about suffering, for me, as a very modern, I guess, 20th century, 21st century person, is how do we respond to it?
To comprehend what?
God. Yeah, Himes
Yes.
also says that, you said that it's difficult to comprehend God even, yeah. So Himes actually has this great line where he says that there's no logos that's adequate to God, but the least false way of talking about God is as agapic love. So it's the least bad way to talk about God, but there's no sufficient way to talk about God, which I think is right.
I was wondering if you guys think that if vulnerability has a place in solitude, without regarding community, and so what's that role?
So the role of vulnerability when you're not interacting with other people in solitude.
So I can think of two instances, but one's maybe not actually solitude, but I'm going to say it anyway. So I think like in contemplative prayer, where one's just like alone with God, there's actually a lot of vulnerability to that there's a way in which the process of spiritual growth or development is about letting oneself be increasingly vulnerable to God and a kind of increased surrender to God's action, and letting go of certain aspects of yourself that are illusory or that are sinful or false. There's a lot of different terms we could use to talk about that. So that's not strictly speaking solitude because God's present, but then I think also just there's a vulnerability. So solitude leads, so Pascal, if you think about Pascal, right, he says we hate being alone. I actually love being alone, but he says we hate being alone because we can't stop thinking about our anxiety about the future, our worries about the past, and so we want to be endlessly engaged in some kind of diversion. And I think the reason for that is that it's hard for us to look honestly at ourselves and our condition. So there's a vulnerability in that, of being honest about ourselves, including our deficiencies, and being alone with our thoughts. I think, yeah, there's a vulnerability in that.
Yeah, I especially like the second part of what you said. About effectively the part about sort of the ways in which we can have to come to terms just by ourselves with our own flaws and deficiencies.
This question is for Dr. Shaw. You mentioned earlier in equating vulnerability possibly with a vice, and then you connected that to the phrase wish fulfillment. That it could lead to a kind of wish fulfillment. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, so what I was saying about wish fulfillment was actually not so much about the, yeah, so that was in relation to, yeah, so these things are connected with one another. So there can be a kind of connection between vulnerability and vice. I definitely don't want to say that vulnerability is a vice or that it is a virtue either. It may be an occasion for sin, let's say. So that can be. So there's a way in which an invulnerable ideal can, like, if you have a view on which virtue suffices for a good human life, and other things like the death of a child or general social disdain don't touch your virtue, you can still live a good human life without having to have social approval or children that are happy or survive. That in certain ways, that if you could live that out, right, that would remove all kinds of vulnerability that might be the occasion for vice. But then I wanted to say about that invulnerable ideal that one worry about it is that it's precisely in the state of mind of having a kind of denial about the fact that we are vulnerable, that our well-being and our living well does depend upon things that aren't under our control, that we could sort of conjure up this notion that virtue is going to be enough for us to live well. But that doesn't sound like the kind of state that we want to be in. Does that help to clarify?
Let's see, Melanie.
For either of you, what is the good death? What is a good death? That's a big question, I realize. We've talked about invulnerable, about how Greeks thought about death in that way, and how could you summarize that just a little bit for us, highlight it?
Okay, so the question is, what is the good death? Somebody wants us to make good on the actual title for the event.
I was against the subtitle.
Yeah, so that is a really hard question. I am certain whatever I say will be incomplete about it. So,
I know it's huge.
but I mean, I think from my thought about the good death would be being in a position of surrender, actually, I think. You know, like, I think an awful lot, I don't know, maybe just like second half of life stuff, but an awful lot of life is that sort of like surrendering a lot of stuff that we thought we needed or thought we desired in favor of something deeper in God. And that, in a way, the good death would be to be prepared to do that in the most ultimate way, to kind of fully give oneself over to God with a kind of confidence and trust, not knowledge or certainty, but confidence and trust in God that all will be well in some sense.
Yeah, I mean, I also don't think I have any very satisfying answer to that. But drawing on sort of, since I'm here representing the ancient Greeks, drawing on a kind of Epicurean answer to that, it would have to be a sort of, it would have to involve a sort of gratitude for the goods that I've had in life. So Epicurus says that if you're not grateful for the goods that you've had in the past, then you are now an old man. Right? Effectively, gratitude plays a crucial role for them. So I would think that that on this way of looking at things, being grateful for the goods that I have had would be at least a crucial element.
I'm interested in how the value of individualism fits with all of this. I get a sense you talked a little bit about vulnerability and community, and when I look at our society, it seems like we lean toward invulnerability being the thing. You know, we need to smell good, we need to walk good, we need to, you know, everything. You know, we're invulnerable to criticism, we're invulnerable to all sorts of things. And I'm just wondering, and I also, so I'm just wondering how individualism fits with the thought of vulnerability versus invulnerability, and partly historically, I'm wondering how it maybe has, the different values have intertwined or fed one another.
Okay, so part of the question is the American ideal of individualism, or the American sentiment of individualism, and how that fits into our conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my first thought is the examples that you gave about ways in which, I mean, the examples you gave sound to me like ways in which we could be not so much actually invulnerable as like in denial about our actual vulnerability. And I think that that kind of outlook cuts across individualism and non-individualism, right? I could think of myself as not impinged upon by outside forces, as being sort of ruggedly surviving in the world on my own. But I could take the same kind of attitude, not just for myself, but with regard to my community, and think of us together as, you know, having all those fine qualities that make us invulnerable, when in fact we're imperfect as a community. So that would be my.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of have a historical narrative. I don't know if it's true, but the narrative would be that, you know, early modern political philosophy and social contract theory essentially says that we're individuals, and it assumes the people we're entering into a society are autonomous, you know, 30-something people who don't have disabilities, not children, not old people, people who can just sort of enter into this contract of their own free will, and that somehow, if they didn't, they could kind of survive out there somewhere. And I think the Greeks would be a good place to come in, and then maybe Mosaic Code or something would be another place. In the ancient Greek world, Socrates says at the beginning of the Republic, well, what do we need to build a city? And there's never even a question that we would need to live in one. I mean, it was sort of like, who would we need in a city, or why would it be better to arrange the division of labor in this way rather than that way? But there's no question that we're in cities. And Aristotle also doesn't take up the question. He says, well, we're born in families, and then the sort of bigger clans kind of constitute one kind of community, and we kind of get to bigger and bigger communities. But never is the individual the only locus of concern, even with all the stuff that I think you rightly pointed out about self-sufficiency. It's not that kind of self-sufficiency.
Yeah. I would just say further about Republic 2, Plato in Republic 2 says that the principle of the formation of the city is need.
Yeah.
It's our need for one another. In the first instance, to supply material goods.
And then even like in the Mosaic Code, and then obviously continuing to Christianity, right? There's a sense that like your good is my good. That is part of love. I mean, because for Christian love, it's actually shared friendship with God. It's a participation in divine love, so that we look to each other not just as other individuals, but as part of the same community of being God's children, of being God's creatures. And I think now, like things like the encyclical Laudato Si, on climate change, that the Pope Francis put out, are trying to say we need to actually extend that beyond the human, even into the whole world. That there's something about our participation in this world and in the environment. That he uses words of kinship. The earth is, Francis says, the earth is a sister who's being ravaged, crying out for our help. That's a kind of kinship.
Have a final question here? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess I've been sort of struggling with how to do this. My question in the end is the so what. And it started sort of with the individualism, the idea of American culture. How do we take these ideas? We can just sit here and sort of discuss and parse all of these ideas, but how do we take them into the world? And should we? And I guess as someone, I'm a campus minister, I work with undergraduates. The idea of vulnerability for this population makes them so anxious they need meds. Like this idea of the world is going to fall apart.
Could you maybe give an example of the kind of...
I'm not really sure what exactly I'm asking, other than this is a great conversation, and I'm interested in it. But ultimately, what I want to know is, when you stand in front of your students and teach these kinds of ancient philosophy or whatever, what do they take with them?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I am not. I do think of my role as teacher as being, in certain ways, unlike the role of a campus minister or a therapist. Right? I do. It's not that I think that what I teach is sort of irrelevant to my students in those modes, but at the same time, I don't think of it as my role to try to, it's my role to try to put ideas in front of them and talk to them about their thoughts about the material. But I don't. It's in a way not my place to try to guide them too much. Yeah.
I think it's a good question. And I actually think maybe because I partly teach in the social justice program where there is a certain amount of accompaniment, it's a different type of course maybe than the ones they're talking about. The questions about resilience, I think there's a lot of conversation right now about resilience among students and a relative lack of resilience. So I guess the thing for me with the vulnerability is, I think I've been trying to say there's a both and here. There's a need to be vulnerable because vulnerability leads us to love, and love has these great fruits and payoff that really nothing else can give us. But that the love part is the resilient part, that the resilience is in the love. So we provide students with community. We provide grieving people with community. It's not just be vulnerable and good luck. It's to understand how vulnerability at one moment, it's not every moment of life, but at some moments of life opens us to love And then also to ask that, the people who are not right now in the midst of the worst part of vulnerability do provide that love, do provide that care, or do provide, the other kinds of things we were talking about, solidarity in moments of injustice, maybe not just nice feeling love, but love that's kind of harder, justice-oriented love. I don't know if that...
I'm not sure what I would so I apologize.
That's
Honestly, I was just trying to figure out how to place some of these concepts into real world culture and what that meant. And maybe this is not the right forum to do that.
No, I think it's actually a great question. So the question really is, how do we link vulnerability to resilience or something like that? Yeah, and again, I think that the way I would answer that is that we have to build a community and culture where people can both learn how to take risk. We don't over-shelter our children. We don't overprotect them from independence. We don't have too many helicopter parents. And on the other hand, it's a mix of challenge and support all the time. Find that right balance between challenge and support for people as they grow. And it's not easy to know when do you let go and maybe someone falls too far, and when do you support, and how do you balance those considerations?
I don't know if this is responsive, but I mean, one thought that the question raises for me is that one of the best things that you can provide for somebody who is sort of afraid of being too vulnerable is a sort of narrative of that it's possible to move past whatever the thing is that they fear, right? So just as an example, like if somebody who is starting teaching came to me and talked about how awful it is, I would tell them like how fearful they are, how much they dislike the idea of going into the classroom every day. I would just tell them, look, so in 2007 I arrived here, I would get sick to my stomach every day before class. Now, that's not the case. So just in this particular instance, for me at least, there's been a kind of exposure therapy. Like just by doing it enough times, you can get to the point where it's not so scary. And that the point extends to other things too, right? So in the past, I've been terrified to ask a question at a talk. Now that I've done it enough times, no big safe fell on me when I said something dumb. It's not the case that people wouldn't talk to me afterwards. So, okay, that was okay. I said something dumb and nothing terrible happened.
Okay.
Just point out that it seems to me that the interesting thing about this, what you're doing here, that is so wonderful, is that you're considering two perspectives. One, you might say that it's kind of like what you mentioned, that at the end of our life, there is the view that that's it. All you can do is hope that you've lived a good life. That is it. There's another view that looks at it from the Christian perspective, and that is that's not the end of life. And so these two viewpoints are being brought together on the campus and considered.
Yes, so any final comments here just on, once again, coming back to this thing of immortality, not immortality, and vulnerability. We've talked about it a bit. We don't have to go here much.
I'm not sure if I have any
I
new
just
thoughts.
thank you for your comment. I think it is great to be able to have dialogue across different kinds of views and to be able to have discourse about, these different concepts of vulnerability and what the good death means in light of them. So thank you. I'm glad it was useful.
Okay, yeah, so let's thank Clerk and Marina, and thank you all for participating.
For more information about the Veritas Forum, including additional recordings and a calendar of upcoming events, please visit our website at veritas.org.